sort of our inherited notions of both apart. I admire really deeply, and I was seeing what kind of event we might want to do at the Poetry Project, and he proposed this event that's thinking about what are the terms of art criticism. And so then from there, we reached out to Rachel Hunter-Himes, a writer I really respect, whose work I first encountered a couple years ago with +1 piece, Museum Pessimism, and just have been keyed into work she's doing. And so this conversation emerged out of these conversations this summer. So thank you so much for coming. Their bios are on the event. Go see all their illustrious, the event page online. And then also, after the event tonight, mingle for a bit. We don't have to run out of here. Well, if you want to, be a sort of team player, we can help us with chairs, or we can chill in the space. And then the next week we have a Monday, Wednesday, Friday event here at the Poetry Project. So come back out. I'm not going to remember everything right now, but they are at the bottom of your second page of your program. But Monday night is Miss Major is coming to celebrate her new book out from Verso. And so she'll be here up from Arkansas, and it'll be in this room. It's a free event. She'll be joined by activists Morgan Basakis and Ina Sato. I think it'll be a really wonderful night. And then we have 2 more readings on Wednesday and Friday, so come back around. And thank you so much for being here. And now over to Jeremy and Rachel.
Hello? Awkward. Hi, good evening. So I'm going to preface this by saying I'm really angry, and I'm going to try really hard not to let that come through tonight. But bear with me in case it does. That's housekeeping. To get us started in tonight, maybe it's helpful to throw out some contextualizing information so that y'all can understand why the hell we're sitting up here talking about people talking about things. And I'm not an artist from a traditional sense. I come to art by way of reading about art. My home is full of shelves of books written by people who are thinking about stuff, physical stuff, performative stuff, sonic stuff. In reading people's writings about stuff, I understood that there was like a sort of permission or a mandate that I could sit in or under and maybe start making stuff. I was a soldier before that, and not in the traditional sense, not in the military sense. I was a musician who was trained to play other people's music. I was trained to take orders, not to actually think through making the things myself. So it's kind of weird and awkward and circuitous that I came to making things, being able to take agency in material, sound, and performance by way of reading other people's thoughts on other people's things. And then it got awkward because as I was making things, I also began to be approached to write responses to things that other people had made. And at the same time was having people write things about my own things that I was making. And so maybe this position that sat on high, maybe higher than some artists and their works for me, became demystified in a really wonderful way. Critics became humans who shit and fart and cry and make missteps. And artists also became people who got to respond to people who shit and make missteps with our own sets of shits and missteps. And certainly there's a personal sort of kernel in there, and maybe you have one of these devices that has access to the wealth of a wealth of human knowledge, and you can maybe just Google some things and do that research on your own. But I think we also, in sort of taking this foundation, it also gives us the opportunity to think about the relationships between critics and Black artists, be they non-Black critics or Black critics and Black artists, and the sort of like productive space of misunderstanding, and also the sort of pratfalls of misunderstandings that show up within or outside failures of legibility or literacy. Does that feel?
Yeah. I'll just say, I mean, Jeremy currently makes art. I am in the position of a person who formerly at one point made art and considered making art as something viable to do in life, but I feel like the way I approach this discussion is at a certain point I came to feel that looking at art, thinking about art, talking about art, and producing an understanding of art that could be communicated was actually much more pleasurable and much more affirming of art in and of itself than actually making it. Looking at it, talking about it, started to feel like a much more natural position, and I started to feel like it was an act of service both to works of art themselves in their singularity, which I think are remarkable things that share the world with us, and also a way to be of service to other people, which is how I arrived at a professional practice of being a museum educator, which is like definitionally talking about art, maybe the practice of active art criticism. But one of the things we wanted to talk about and come together tonight is the way in which, because I think of a confluence of historical factors, some artists, and I think our case study tonight is Black artists, but I think the same could be said of other artists, have been uniquely underserved specifically by criticism, by the written practice of public-facing art criticism. And so we've put together a collection of texts, like documents, pieces of evidence, that we were using and are using to think through this problem and its complications, and maybe arrive at some possible solutions or ways forward out of what I feel like, frankly, is I don't want to be dramatic, but a certain impasse when it comes to the public engagement of the work of Black artists. So.
I do want to ask about this impasse that maybe we see things sitting at. And also, I think as things come up for you as audience members, we want to invite you to maybe not jump in, but like raise a hand and we'll find our way. Not to be all professorial or whatever, but like it's just easier that way. So maybe I'm curious to hear you speak about the impasse that you just mentioned. Like, what is that impasse?
Yeah, I mean, I think like to lay it out, I think that these impasses that have come about in the critical engagement of the work of Black artists are inheriting or represent an inheritance of like long patterns, long-standing failures in the engagement of the work of Black artists. And when I say long-standing, I think they date to roughly the mid-20th century, basically, because that's the moment in which, for the first time, the work of Black artists is treated as a matter of concern for the art world. It's not to say that Black people were not making art before that. Obviously they were. We can look at the Harlem Renaissance. But that art was being consumed maybe within the community and being reviewed by publications intended for Black audiences, like The Crisis, a political publication aimed at the Black world. But at a certain point, critics, mainstream critics, are forced to or end up having to contend with the work of Black artists because it starts to be exhibited in galleries in New York and major retrospective exhibitions that travel from LA to Chicago to New York. And I think at that moment there emerges a real challenge in articulating a good critical response. And what gets produced are a lot of bad reviews. And something we're interested in thinking about tonight is like, some reviews are bad because they say that the art is bad, but they say the art is bad in a way that is good, in that they are making an informed critical judgment, but other reviews are just bad, and that they're unable to approach, they're unable to contend with, they neurotically just can't even approach the object because there are barriers between the artist and the object of their critique. And so, a lot of the reviews that are coming out of Black art when it becomes a subject of concern are bad in that way. So, we'll maybe share some examples of those with you tonight. But, from that moment onward, I think there have been a lot of really inherited and pervasive problems when it comes to the engagement with Black art. And I know I'm being really vague. I feel like we can get into what those problems are, but maybe we should turn to texts.
I think we'll just jump into the text, and I have a question that I want to throw back in just a minute. Oh.
No problem.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we sort of broke this up into a series of case studies where we're able to look a bit more historically, go through some historic examples, and then come to something more contemporaneous. And we thought it was appropriate to start with I think a 1944 New York Times review of a show by Mark Rothko and Gottlieb.
Who are not Black artists, just
FYI. You could, if you don't believe us, you can Google it.
But the reason we wanted to bring this in is because, and maybe you can speak more to this, our starting point here, one of the many starting points, emerges out of the moment that artists speak back to critics. And we think about that because there are several examples of, I think, Black artists in particular speaking back to critics because they feel that a review has failed them in some particular way. And I think that, on the one hand, people might read this as petulant, as petty. It's like the artist has already said their piece and they're not allowed to talk anymore after they make their work. But I think that the circumstances that face Black artists in art criticism have maybe necessitated necessitated that response. But we wanted to begin with this example when these artists, Rothko and Gottlieb, also do this act of speaking back to a critic who reviews their work, but on very different terms. These two artists have received a bad review. The review is just kind of dismissive of abstract expressionism. It's basically is this good? Is this art? And Rothko and Gottlieb are able to respond on these terms where they're we don't have to defend our work. It speaks for itself because it is art, and it's art at the highest level. It's art in the upper echelons of art. It's art in its purest form, and that's the terrain that they establish for a response. But as we'll see, and as Jeremy, I think you want to share, the ways in which Black artists have had to or wanted to speak back to their critics are quite different.
Right, and I think that gives us the opportunity to bring in Adrienne Piper, not just as someone who, I'll jump forward, penned her own response to Ken Johnson's review of a new museum show from 2000, and that is one mode of responding, but what happens when an artist takes a more structural approach and allows a set of critics to better understand the tools that they're working with as it relates to their or her work? And sort of I think the word you used was pedantic, and I would say that lovingly about Adrienne Piper and her work in general. But what it is to present people with the tools to be able to show up and do the job that they think that they're going to do, right? That's not the same as responding. This is teaching.
Yeah. Adrienne Piper, for those of you, maybe you're very familiar with her work. She has a massive corpus of work. A lot of it is in the territory of conceptual art. But part of her practice, or alongside her practice, is a very, very large number of letters to the editor or letters she has written taking issue with criticism of her work. And you said, I said, and I do say it's incredibly pedantic because she really is interested in just extremely basic frameworks for approaching her work. She insists on facticity. She insists that to write about my work, you need to be armed with the facts. And she writes these letters that's like, you don't seem to understand what a fact is. Here's a definition of a fact. And here is, like you can see here, she says like, make sure you get the facts right, perceptual facts. And she's saying this because I think what she's speaking to is that people look at her work and they're unable to see it, or they have certain assumptions about what she was thinking about, what she meant to accomplish when she created it. But I think she's the example, like the case study example of an artist who speaks back to their critics. And I think on the one hand, is this petulant? Is it picky? I mean, I think you're choosing to frame it as it's generous, it's generative. The reviews that she takes issue with are never bad. They're not hatchet jobs, but she just feels that they are wrong.
Right.
And so, I think we have to wonder, like, what does it mean is it okay for an artist to say that the critic is wrong about their work, or is it not? Or like, on what grounds is she establishing this wrongness? Interestingly, I think Adrian Piper is someone whose approach to her own work and its interpretation flies in the face of a lot of our contemporary maybe expectations or lenses through which work of a Black artist should be interpreted. Adrian Piper has, in many, many places, says like, do not refer to me as a Black artist, do not refer to me as a female artist, do not refer to me as a Black philosopher, do not refer to me as a woman philosopher. So right off the bat, the critical frames for interpreting her art through Blackness or through being her gender have been pushed aside in favor of what she insists on as like facticity. And so I think for me, it speaks to this is kind of a basic assumption, but like maybe the pervasiveness of really sort of pat formulas for interpreting the work of artists that she responds to and she dismisses.
Right, which it sits, like to highlight, it sits in a very different space than advocating for the merits of an object or an image, right? Like that's not saying the art is or the art isn't. It's literally, or it's laying out the criteria and methodologies for even being able to approach what is or isn't art, which is why I think of it as much more of a structural approach than, say, the response from Rothko and Gottlieb. And of course, like you said, this is like a sort of early moment that points to maybe an inherited legacy that many artists have had foist upon them since. And so I want to jump forward in time and slides to our dear friend Taja Cheek. And I was backstage with Taja at a thing earlier this year, and she was speaking about this review that she received in the Wire magazine, and her excitement, you can read, in having her new album reviewed in the Wire by, for all, I guess, like accounts, by a reviewer who should, heavy scare quotes, be equipped with a set of tools and literacies to be able to approach this thing and handle it with care and a deeper understanding. I'll read her text. The Wire has been my favorite magazine for over 20 years. I was truly humbled to be on the cover. Humbled doesn't even cut it. I cried when I got the email. On top of that, Donovan Smallwood is an incredible photographer, and I always love working with him. It deeply saddened me to have to send this note to The Wire this morning/afternoon. I am sharing the annotations I sent to The Wire before the article was published online. I would like to thank all of the interviewers and editors in the past that have shown my work care and approached it with nuance. I hope that this instance will be an aberration and not a new normal. And we pulled some slides from, we pulled some slides both showing her annotations, and I think what's exciting is not just what's exciting and important is not just like the artist speaking back, but really sort of like, I mean, it's visually stunning, but also like, that's a lot of annotations. This is like you know, a handful of the 10 or so pages of very, very, very thick annotations, and they're as simple as Tasha saying, I don't think or say that in the video, or I don't think or say that the video is an outlier for what most viewers are used to. Like a literal correction, and let's see if we can zoom. We can't zoom.
I don't think we can zoom.
We can't zoom. But there's also like this mixture of hardness. What hardness? I think like, I love this idea of the annotation in this way because it gives the opportunity not only to like talk back, but to allow for a series of questionings. And I think maybe it becomes apparent over the course of this conversation that the thing that maybe we're excited to pull apart is like what happens when the review is not a statement, but a series of questions or a volleying back and forth. And then there were also like maybe like supporting evidence to like undergird this, what Taja was flagging as a mishandling of her work by The Wire in larger instances. So just supporting information for like the case study or for her thing. This random person, Bant Lopez, had some things to say about The Wire's mishandling, as did Luca Toyboy. And these are like two of like hundreds of comments that I was able to comb through and just find supporting evidence that like maybe the knife isn't as sharp or the tool isn't as sharp as the page might lead us to believe. And this isn't a damnation, but like the potential for a much more exciting and rigorous conversation where like I don't trust what I see. Me, Jeremy Toussaint-Baptiste. I don't trust what I see or hear or feel. I have to connect it with you, with you, with you, with you. And I think like that does a really scary thing to the field of critique if like it has to be peer reviewed. I love saying peer reviewed phenomenology. I'm just gonna put it out there in the world. But like, what is it when the person who has access to the record and thus access to a position of power and sort of like dictating what will be thought of as history, when they don't get their facts right or when there's like a stumbling from outside but also from within. And I think what's exciting about Taja's piece is that like this was another black writer, a black like alt writer who maybe might not get the details, but like should. I want to interrogate the should. Like, is there a sensitivity needed, or is that like a sort of kids handling of the thing where it's expected that black artists should not be thoroughly critiqued by black critics or by other critics?
Yeah, I mean, so when you first shared with me this piece from Taja where she's made the choice to publicly speak back to a critic, to a critical review that she deemed a failure, inadequate, it led me to think about the other ways that criticism has failed black artists. And Taja's is an interesting case because it's a bad article. She says it's bad. I guess I agree. But it's written with good intent. It's written to share her work with the world, but it fails in I think like a myriad of tiny ways. Just generalizations, overstatements, bad writing. But it made me want to take a historical look at what are the other ways that this criticism has been bad, and I have been thinking about this review by a critic named Harold Rosenberg, he's very, very famous. We are like way after the golden age of art criticism, which like people place in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But a figure like Harold Rosenberg was enormously important, influential, like a god of writing about art. He didn't write about a lot of work by black artists because there wasn't a huge amount to see at the time. But in this instance, he did. And I find that this review reveals something that, you know, I'm kind of wanting to say that Black art really, the work of Black artists really troubles paradigms in art writing. Harold Rosenberg seems genuinely unable to exercise his extremely good taste, his extremely powerful ability to discern meanings of work. He reaches a total impasse when he tries to think about the subject of this review, which is a retrospective of Black American art. It's the first retrospective of Black American art to happen in this country. It happens in '77. So in this review, we see him say a couple things. We see him say, okay, it's the premise that there could be a show of only Black artists is mistaken because it's not an aesthetic criteria. He says that there's nothing that unifies the work of these artists such that they should be seen together, considered together, or reviewed together. So that's one of the things that he says. And then he also is saying that because this political category of Blackness has been applied here, the work that has been slotted into this category is not worthy of aesthetic judgment. He's like, I can't make an aesthetic statement about this work because I'm receiving it as a political category. And so we see for him, and I think for many other critics, the fact that a Black artist makes work really collapses the aesthetic and political categories together in a way that he cannot find his way out of. It's an uncomfortable review. It's kind of a seething review, but I mostly see a critic who is really struggling to make his way forward in a terrain that for him conflates the aesthetic and the political. So this is reflective of broader tendencies in criticism, to be unable to understand that Blackness, the fact of an artist being Black, can have aesthetic meaning, can have political meaning, or could have neither meaning in the work. It doesn't, neither of those things, it doesn't have to be in play. We also see at this time critics who are, you know, they're really confused when Black artists make political work because they say, I can't make an aesthetic judgment about political work, but then they're also really upset when Black artists make work that isn't political, because then they're like, what's Black about this? I don't get it. Like, if it's not about a lynching and it's not about a jazz club, like, how can I use my knowledge of what being Black is to evaluate this work? And so that's like a problem that I think emerges in this moment when Black art is first being seen, and I think really persists today. We see critics who are looking at the work, trying to figure out why it's Black, how Blackness is meaningful in its interpretation, where politics is, and obviously this drives like artists absolutely crazy, like up the wall, because it creates a serious barrier between the critic, I think, or viewers, regular viewers who don't also write about art, and the work itself, because they approach it they approach it from a position that can't understand the relationship between the aesthetic category and the political category.
Right. And I think I feel like I sit in a really complicated space around that, because I do maintain that the art thing, the gesture, the object, the image, the whatever, sort of needs to maintain its status as something that doesn't function. I kind of like, and you know, to make something political intends, like there's an intended function to make something political, right? Like to create a work and say like, I am imbuing this with a sense of political intention and ideology, that does put it into a space of function. So in a sense, I do agree with that, and at the same time, I wonder if that is it's not a rigorous enough reading, in the sense that even the art object with its non-function presents us with the opportunity to experience jouissance or sublimation, or these different things that are at some register functional. Mm-hmm. So the insistence on the things need to stay non-functional is kind of like a little baby brain.
Yeah, or if you allow as you say, jouissance or pleasure to become the function of the work, then maybe it's not like out of the question for a political intent to be another one of those functions of the work. But the aesthetic judgment in like formalist criticism, or criticism that is all about the way something looks and how the way it looks makes you feel, really can't accommodate the idea of like the political function of work of art in particular.
Right, and I think what becomes concerning with this like either or is that the work and the artist, regardless of which side, there's like an instrumentalization of that individual and the work in a way that doesn't actually pay attention to the individual or the work, which just feels important to highlight. And I guess you also pointed out earlier tonight that at the same time that Rothschild's review was being written, Bill Gunn was creating Ganja and Hess, or Ganja and Hess had been released. This is the original poster and another Time poster. And this was the New York Times review, that little, tiny little square over there. We're not going to spend time talking about what was said, as opposed to spending a little bit of time with Gunn's response. And I think what's exciting here is that, like, this is an example of an artist responding seemingly, like, through the same mode or medium, like he was written about in the Times, and I think he responded in the Times. And I think that's, like, a really interesting misuse or like way around using the review and the institution, the publishing institution in a way that maybe it wasn't always intended to.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bill Gunn here, I mean, I love the movie. Ganja and Hess is a great movie. I really like this letter, because, you know, unlike Adrian Piper, who is, as we said, kind of generous in her responses to reviews, where she's really like, I'm trying to help you be a better critic. Bill Gunn is just kind of, you know, airing out whoever wrote these bad reviews in the first place. But he says a couple things that I really am thinking about and want to draw out. He says that there are certain things about being a Black artist that might be, he's saying, too private to expose to the arrogance of white criticism. He says that it's a problem that his work is being, he says, graded, evaluated by a stranger to the artist and to the culture, by which he means Black culture. I think he says he's very quotable here. He says, I love this, another critic wondered, where was the race problem? If he looks closely, he will find it in his own review. Like, that's nice. But it's another one of these examples of, like, someone saw Ganja and Hess and they're like, I don't get how, this isn't political. Like, I don't understand, like, how is this Black? Because it's not about, like, politics, it's about vampires. So, you know, we can leave that there. But this idea that his work can't be evaluated by someone who is a complete stranger to the artist and the culture, I think, to me, rhymes with what I think or want to suggest is a pervasive but maybe unspoken idea in criticism today, which is that white critics cannot adequately treat the work of Black artists. I think this is something a lot of people think, but I don't think it gets said that much. It gets said sometimes, but the contents of this idea are that the work of Black artists emerges from a place that is impenetrable, inaccessible to critics who do not share that experience. And I want to, first of all, like, investigate, is that something that people really think? I think it is. And so what are the implications of that position? Like, what does that position mean about the relationship between viewers and the work of art? I think that it says, or maybe reflects, something quite serious that exceeds the art world, which is about people's concern about, like, the limits of certain kinds of solidarity. So I think it's actually a bigger question than art criticism, even though we're talking about art criticism tonight. But I'm interested in probing this territory. Are we ever prepared to hear a white critic say that the work of a Black artist is bad? A lot of people would really not want to hear that, which means that a lot of the reviews that get written today by white critics about the work of Black artists fail in certain ways because they are unable to advance a truly critical judgment. And that makes them, I think, bad reviews.
Yeah. I mean, in that way, they've also non-black critics have also inherited a legacy, right? Like a black artist has inherited a legacy of maybe having ill-informed or a type of review that doesn't go as deep as one might desire, but it's also like the other side of that is these writers are writing through and from a lineage that historically not just permits like deep critique, but focuses on maybe one or two specific modes of what is considered to be deep critique without other, a broader pool of understanding. I don't know if I think that white artists or white critics should be dispermitted from writing about people from outside of
I also
their
don't
group.
think this.
But I mean, I also don't think that the black reviewer is going to always handle the black artist's work with the best grace or with the deepest understanding. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think all of these can be exciting and productive ruptures where again, if it keeps going after the thing has been published and the review actually doesn't end when the thing is published, maybe that misunderstanding can rupture and sprout up some more interesting shit.
Yeah, if a review was bad, did fail, and it wasn't the final word on whatever it was, and it's not such a problem.
Right.
But the thing about art criticism is the way that it somehow often permanently enters a work into the historical record, the art historical record, and then the work can't evade that reading. And this is especially true when it comes to ephemeral arts, like dance and performance. If your performance gets one review and that review kind of sucks, that's it, it's over. So if the review wasn't always the final word, then it wouldn't really matter if it failed in certain ways. It would be generative, and that's what I think some artists, and maybe more artists, hope to achieve maybe when they respond to their critics.
Right.
What we have here is an example of a good bad review, in that this is a review by Adam Gopnik, a white critic, in which he exercises a genuinely critical judgment on Basquiat and says Basquiat is bad, which I'm I don't know, maybe he made some points. But we include this because this is for some people, the paradigmatic example of a bad review, in that it's bad because people say it's racist. I don't think this is a racist review. This is a review in which Adam Gopnik makes the case that Basquiat's work is kind of a pastiche. It's kind of a pastiche of certain forms of primitivism, like the primitivism of Picasso, and that it responds maybe too much to the market into which it enters, which he describes as Madison Avenue. But people really did not like this review. Bell Hooks really, really did not like this review. And so it is put forward as an example of a bad review, bad because racist. But, I think this is important to think about because it does return me this question of is there any world in which we would accept a white critic saying Basquiat was bad? It's not something a lot of critics would want to say, I think. So for me, if it is the case that there are these stakes, these inherited historical stakes in the criticism of the work of black artists, does that mean that the evaluation of any work of art by any black artist always has these political stakes, despite the insistence by many black artists that their work is not political, but the review is often received as polemic, as a political piece of writing. So that's a real impasse. That's really challenging. It's really challenging territory. And it raises the question, do critics owe something different to black artists than they owe to white artists? For example, and I don't think these questions only apply to black art. I think these questions apply to works of art by other non-white artists. But in this review, people have really dismissed this review. They've panned this review because it advances this critical judgment. And there's a much broader discussion about this is something people really dwell on, which is whether any art criticism today is doing a critical judgment. This review is from 1992. But I feel like, I do feel like art criticism today makes critical judgments. I think it says some things are good and some things are bad. I think it's a lot less willing to do so than like literary criticism for some reason. Like you read that a novel is bad way more than you ever read that like a work of art is bad. I don't really have an answer for why that is. But the work of art by Black artists receives a truly critical evaluation with far less frequency. And I think that's because of these inherited concerns that come with this long legacy of lots and lots of failures to engage the work of Black artists adequately. But you know, to make my position clear, I don't want to suggest, I don't think it's good to suggest that only Black artists could write about Black work. I don't think it's good to suggest that lived experience is a criteria for evaluating a work of art. I don't think the lived experience of being Black is necessary to engage the work of a Black artist. I think that's an untenable aesthetic position because it really forecloses aesthetic possibility and engagement with work. And I think it's an untenable political position because it's anti-solidaristic. It says that there are firm boundaries against, over which you cannot reach. You cannot access other people through them, and that's not true, and that's like a really bad idea to hold.
It's also a little bit of a fantasy in the sense that like none of us exist in a vacuum, right? Like I don't go back to. None of us goes back to an enclave of individuals who are exactly like us without encountering, rubbing elbows, listening to music, eating food prepared by, eating food grown by, dealing with some shit that's been touched by somebody far outside of our sphere of experience. So then it becomes like deeply unrelational. There's no like, and to me that's at the heart of both critique and thing making, is trying to relate or communicate a set of feelings, ideals, concepts, whatever, to another individual or set of individuals. And there's no need to relate if we're all in the room and we're all exactly the same. It kind of defeats itself. And it also dispermits me, you, any of us who aren't like a singular thing from being poor. Like it presumes that we're not porous beings. It presumes that like it's the tired thing. Black people don't listen to rock, right? Like white people don't know how to dance. Like it's these things played out in maybe more specific and applicable ways in our field, but these are tired tropes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we started off thinking like, okay, this is a case study about art criticism that reveals certain things about like patterns in the art world that are bad. But I think ultimately, like where I ended up thinking about this is that it's possible to read the problems in the criticism of Black art and the assumptions that people have about who is allowed to and who can make statements about Black art as revealing or as a case study in and of themselves for like broader questions about identification and solidarity across various fictional lines or boundaries between people.
I think it could be nice to go back to, you sort of started to talk about like how these bad reviews maybe take on, or you know, how a review can take on a higher or lower tenor as it relates to specifically like body-based or performance or ephemeral types of works. And so we have this excerpt from, is it The Atlantic?
It's The New Yorker.
The New Yorker, thank you.
94.
Thank you. Speaking to Bill T. Jones's work Still Here, and I don't know, it just is another example where like the thing doesn't exist, or maybe it does at the Park Ave Armory because Bill T. Jones is like a force now. But after the thing leaves the stage, this is the record. Mm-hmm. This becomes like reality and truth. Mm-hmm. And we're pretty far down the rabbit hole now, and we've seen that this thing that gets logged into the record as reality and truth, like, can oftentimes have holes or gaps or misunderstandings or need correction.
Yeah, this is a review of a performance dance piece choreographed by Bill T. Jones, in which dance is interspersed with performance, speech, remarks from people who, for different reasons, are approaching the end of their life. They are terminally ill. Really just out of the park, the critic says, I have not seen Still Here, and I have no plan to review it. They say this at the beginning of their review. They did write the review, but they refuse to see this work. And this is, you might think this sounds insane, like the critic just refusing to see the work. This is weirdly common. It happens a weird amount. It's just like they're like, I'm not going to review it, and I didn't see it, and then they write the review. But the thorny problem, or the insane thing about this review, is why this critic feels like the work is unreviewable. And what she says is that because the work is founded on what she calls victimhood, it has thereby rendered itself impervious or impenetrable or unaddressable by critique. She says, and I'm going to read you a little bit from this because I can't really paraphrase it because it's insane, but she says that victimhood is a kind of mass delusion that has taken hold of previously responsible sectors of our culture. The cultivation of victimhood by institutions dedicated to the care of art is a menace to all art forms, particularly performing art forms. She says, I can't review someone I feel sorry for or hopeless about. In this category of undiscussability are those dancers who I feel sorry for because of the way they present themselves as dissed blacks, abused women, or disenfranchised homosexuals, performers who make out of victimhood victim art. She says at the end, for me, Bill T. Jones is undiscussable because he has taken sanctuary amongst the unwell. Victim art defies criticism not only because we feel sorry for the victim, but because we are cowed by art. So she says, when an artist takes up, I think she's using victimhood as a shorthand for like identity, because she's not only talking about Bill T. Jones as a black choreographer, she's also talking about people who have AIDS, or gay. Like when she aligns victimhood identity and says, when a work of art is about this, it can't be critiqued. It has rendered itself imperviable to critique. She's saying it's anti-aesthetic. She's saying it's not art. She's saying it defies criticism by erecting the monolith of what? Of tragedy, of marginalization, of something that is alien to her, and something so alien to her that she can't approach it as a critical reviewer. I mean, this review is just so weird and so out of left field that I'm almost having a hard time looping it in to what we were talking about. But
it does echo the sort of like refusal to critique art on political terms.
Yeah.
Like I think we can, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's another example of like the critics thinking it's impossible to make an aesthetic judgment of something that has this like political intent, or what she sees as political intent. And it's really sad because she is, I think for herself and for surely many other people who read this review in the New Yorker, denying, foreclosing the possibility of having an experience and a meaningful experience with works of art that belong to this category of victimhood art that she's asserting. And that's, I think, vicious. I think it's a violent and vicious thing to do, to try to completely alienate this entire category of art that she has created in this review. But I see it as kind of pathological, as kind of neurotic, but also as in some ways she's afraid maybe of what would happen if she did treat this aesthetically and did approach it with seriousness of purpose.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the time when it was written feels also important. Like, I can only wonder what an experience of going downtown, like if you step below 14th Street in 1994 to see some work, like it feels like dismissing not just an entire like genre.
This was actually in Brooklyn. It was at BAM. So
Excuse me.
Further.
Even further. But I'm just like thinking about the landscape of performance in the mid-90s in the city and how, you know, it's queer as shit now. It was queer as shit then. It was like one could easily apply a lens of like victim art to an entire region of practice in the city.
Yeah, an easy way to like rule out enormous categories of art making. Like, I guess for her, for all time.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is an example of a piece that it's really bad, and leads us into, you know, I think it's so bad. I think it's neurotic. I think it's kind of pathological. And here's another example of, you know, we brought this in. This is another.
It's just really, really bad.
Okay, so this isn't the review. This isn't the review itself. We actually can't find the review because it's been scrubbed from the internet.
It's that bad.
That's how you know it's really bad. This is a review of the review.
A critique of the review.
It's a critique of the review.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, part of what we were thinking about tonight is like, you know, when a review is really bad, like what makes it bad? This one is just racist.
This one's just bad. It's also like, I think where we landed at the end of it, because we can see things, there are certain words that come up, and this is in relation to Kehinde Wiley's work, right? Like, so she's quoting Jessica Dawson, who is referring to Kehinde Wiley's practice as seemingly predatory, right? Like, what is Dawson's argument for Wiley's predatory behavior? What year was this?
2015.
So 9 years later, right? Like, I think what's curious about this is like the sort of unsubstantiated claim of predatory behavior, which gets read as racist, which is racist because it's unsubstantiated. 9 years passes, and now we have, like, you know, more than rumblings of the same person who was defended as not predatory. That person is, I think, fully outed as a predator. I don't keep up with the things, but I saw on the internet. But I think, like, what's really interesting in, like, trying to suss this thing out is, one, yeah, that thing has been completely scrubbed from the internet. The hyperlink in
all that's left of it are the critiques of
exactly,
which is, I think, interesting because it was as a review, it was kind of an easy target. I mean, I don't know if you all remember 2015, people were going crazy for this Brooklyn Museum Kehinde Wiley exhibition. I don't know who was there. I was there. I was like, wow,
yeah.
These paintings are really big.
like, wow, a black Napoleon.
But I think in this moment, rather than there were some reviews of the show, but there were a lot of reviews of this review. And I think in the absence of people able to make a critical judgment of Kehinde Wiley, which we still don't have a lot of great critical judgment on Kehinde Wiley, but people were really ready to take down the bad review of his work, more than I think they were willing to actually contend with his work. And his work really needs contending with, not because it's good, for another different reason. Anyways.
I mean, maybe you should write the review.
No. Yeah, I mean, it's sad because when I saw it in 2017, I was like I said, wow, these paintings are really big, but now, like, it's different. It's
such a trip because there's a giant statue less than a mile away from where I live in Richmond of his, like one of his subjects sitting atop the horse, not unlike the painting. And every time I go out for a run, I have to contend with this monumentalized, like, quite poor work of art. That's an aside. That has nothing to do with anything. It's just that every time I leave the home to go for a run, I'm reminded that, like, this big thing exists by this, like, big, kind of not rigorous man.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's relevant because, like, who will say in writing that, like, the work of someone like Hinde Wiley is bad?
Or who's going to publish that?
Or who's going to
like
publish that?
what publication is going to risk loss of ad revenue, loss of readership, or like a negative blowback?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot
publish that.
There's a lot of like. I mean, this isn't really the topic of our conversation, but I think there's a lot of really conceptually boring, I think, reasons why that we haven't addressed why critics are maybe hesitant to say the work of certain artists is bad, or even to give it a truly critical assessment, which just has to do with the closeness, the real closeness between like art writing and the art world, and the need that critics have, reasonable need, to make a living plying their craft of writing criticism, which you don't get to do if you make like an enemy of like Larry Gagosian. So that's like, it's not a thrilling conceptual reason about this like reluctance to critically evaluate the work of Black artists, but it is also a reason that's in play. So I don't want to like leave it out completely.
Yeah. I think that was the last one. It was the last one. So maybe this is a moment to like go a little more ad hoc, or invite some chat from the folks out there, if there are any emergent thoughts. Hey.
Thanks, guys. This rules. I mean, just thinking about the statue, though, it is totally relevant, though, because like that statue is able to be this giant present. It's in your life because Hinde Wiley has managed to grow to this kind of figure because he has not been properly critiqued in his work, right? So I think there's this interesting mechanism too of like, then you have these major figures that are permeating the culture that haven't been like regulated by the mechanism of critique as well. And so then the representatives of quote unquote like major Black art, and not that this is like particular to a category, though it happens all the time,
Right.
are like then, you know, I don't know, maybe less engaged with or less like they haven't had this force of developing either. Like it's I don't know. That's not my question.
I think what's also interesting in like highlighting that it's a monument, I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with Richmond, Virginia, but it was, you know, a really big city for a lot. Richmond is the former capital of the Confederacy, right? They love them some Confederate lore, to the point where there are stretches, miles and miles and miles of what is called Monument Ave, that had these monuments to Confederate generals like for miles and miles. At around the same time, if I'm not mistaken, the Wiley was going up, that's when the monuments were coming down. And of course, that's like a beautiful poetic turn, right? But I'm also like, why does the criticality stop there? And like, there are fully valid reasons to be critical of the things that came down on Monument Avenue, but I'm also interested in like, I don't know, why does that stop at the museum space? Why does that stop at the Virginia Museum for Fine Arts, where like it literally sits on the lawn, and it would take less than a minute to pull up the sort of like confirmed allegations of him being an abuser, and this like very visible bastion is still there, which, you know, this obviously sits in a very different space of like critique than art, you know, traditional art critique does. But I also think social and aesthetic critiques are increasingly enmeshed, and maybe this is actually a thing that allows us to start thinking past some of the exhausting inheritances that critics have been dealt, as well as artists. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's really important to like consider the ways in which like critics and artists have been like dealt the same like shitty hand when it comes to like the way the art world is today, or the inheritance of the bad criticism of the work of Black artists. Like they're like networked together in this like inherited problem or ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Also about publishing publishers, right? So you spoke about the reality that architects have of needing to earn a living, and the desire that many have to, let's say, critique on that notion of art. And I wanted to correlate that to the emergence of substance, right? And so the amount of testimonies and other resources that people are releasing, just how, just to, yeah, it's more of a discussion question, how people are navigating that in terms of making a living, and then also having to work extra hours to still have their voice, right? And to still be present in their desires and their ability to critique well, and maybe their ability to be honest, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I just wanted to talk a bit more about those aspects.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, yeah, I mean, you really can't escape this, like, this analysis that, you know, the ways in which art writing happens today are shaped by, like, you know, economic forces that dictate about the livelihood of critics. I mean, I think that, you know, people who, you know, maybe would have wanted to be art critics are today instead trying to be or become curators, because you can make a little bit more money doing that, which, you know, maybe in like, I don't know, the 60s, you got like paid like $15,000 to write an article. I'm making that up, but something like, I don't know, like, you know, but now you get paid $15,000 to be a curator. But, you know, I think that it's really good. It's good that there's this like alternative ecosystem of arts writing that's happening. I think, you know, some of it tends to really lean hard the other way, like the mainstream art press in ways that are kind of like unproductive. But, you know, I don't think it's, you know, totally desirable to have only like kind of like self-published Substack type writing that is willing to like exercise the critical judgment. But then, you know, on the other hand, you think about the figure of the art writer today. Art writers today are really closely tethered to like institutions like the New York Times, or, you know, if we posit that the curator has replaced the critic, which I think is kind of true, you know, they're tethered to institutions like galleries and MoMA, and then you have only like people speaking with the institutional voice of the major newspaper and the gallery and the museum, which I don't think is good, because that means, you know, we have, if we're thinking about like the art historical record, the way things enter into history and art history, then it's like only an institutional voice speaking, and it's like it's a totally closed loop. The work enters into the gallery, interpreted in the curator's essays, and it leaves into art history only ever having been truly interpreted in that place. So, yeah.
I mean, I can't really speak to the economic aspect of it because I don't exist primarily as an arts writer. It's more like a tertiary aspect of my practice. I think like what does feel exciting is like something like a Substack exists outside of how things traditionally function on this thing, which is scaffolded and undergirded by advertising and underwriting. And so are art publications. We love an art publication, but like, let's be real, they're full of ads. And that's a necessary part of things, just like it's necessary to keep the flow of images and material going in this thing. But I think a Substack offers like for a less mitigated engagement with that set of thoughts and practices, that like, not to argue for a purity of it, but I get exhausted being sold Warby Parker when I'm trying to read theory, right? Like I already have my fucking glasses. And
That you're
if you
using
know,
to read the theory,
right?
so
And if you know me, you know that I've
that.
had 2 pairs of glasses in the last 15 years. It's not gonna change. But what will change is the mode through which I engage with that stuff. So I find myself not engaging with much screen-based anything, unless it's like a PDF of a flat text or a Substack or something like this. And I also like kind of don't push my students towards publication or anything that might be. I try and push my students towards less institutionally mediated forms of critique, if only to like give them something to put in encounter with the things that they are reading in Art Forum or Freeze or Aperture or any of the mainstream publications.
I don't know when we have to stop.
Oh, yeah.
Should we stop?
We should stop.
I was gonna say one more question.
There's also someone over there.
I'll try to speak up, but I was going to say, first of all, thank you. I really appreciate the precision in the conversation. I guess my question is, so you described and talk about this relationship between the artist and the critic, and I'm curious about that from the perspective of critics who also are doing something interesting aesthetically or formally. So critics for whom their criticism is also art. I guess I'm wondering how do you think that sort of changes that conversation or that relationship? And also, is there anyone who you think is doing that in an interesting way right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really good. I think that it is good when a piece of criticism is formally interesting, textually interesting, is itself maybe aesthetic in some way, because I think it helps to close the gap or reveal maybe the falseness of the binary between object and interpretation. I think that works of art and their criticism are part of the same close-knit ecosystem. I think they are, they both stand together as a statement about the value of a work of art or the possibilities that lie in engaging with it. I think they testify together to the possibility more broadly of what art does in our life and our world. And I think that if a review is also somehow beautiful or interesting as an object of art, it shows okay, they're on the same side, they're on the same team. They're not fighting against each other. And I think they shouldn't be. But now I can't think of anyone who's doing anything that is like that. So I don't.
I mean, I think I've encountered people who've would you like to read this text or proofread this text? And it's wild and experimental and formally all over the place and making me sort of, choreographing my act of reading. And then it gets to the editing desk where, it has to fit a word count and a certain set of design frameworks. And that sort of experimental nature or exciting nature gets put to the wayside because at the end of the day, the thing has to get published and it has to get published in a very specific way. So there's a sort of pragmatic aspect to that I don't know if I see it happening in the paper ones, but sometimes things come to my email where I'm this is wild. This is a wild way of thinking about looking at art. I think one person who comes to mind is Andrea Anderson, who lives in New Orleans and is the executive director of the Rivers Institute for Contemporary Thought. But she used to also work at the Contemporary Art Center in New Orleans and also spent, maybe 20 or so years up here as a writer and thinker. I think, someone like Adrian Edwards is doing incredibly brilliant and rigorous work. I don't know that I even desire wild experimentation from her because she's doing the thing that she does so fucking well, that I'm just so fulfilled. I don't know. Maybe that's it.
Well, maybe this is something we can, as we break into more molecular conversations, we can all brainstorm together. People who are experimenting with form and criticism, but let's thank you so much.
Thank you.